Fair use disclaimer. This video documentary may make use of copyrighted material. This material is being used for educational purposes only, and thus falls under fair use as detailed in Title 17 U.S.C. Section 106A to 117 of the U.S. Copyright Law. Music is the universal language. That's what everyone says, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean for studies of culture, studies of politics? What can the universal language tell us when we don't speak the language of the country? China as a country has a very storied history. It's been around for over 5,000 years. It's gone through many upheavals of politics and revolutions and cultural changes and ideology shifts. And it can be overwhelming and hard to understand, and tracking the ideas that define the different periods is an incredibly daunting task. One of my favorite pieces of military music that comes from China is March of the Volunteers, which is the current national anthem of the People's Republic of China. The story and the lyrics of the song are entirely reflective of the cultural belief that caused the formation of the Republic. The lyrics never explicitly name their enemies, nor do they name the Republic or the party. For a national anthem, there's very little nation being presented. Instead, what they presented is an ideology, a sense of community and identity that gives people something to latch onto. The piece became a staple well before the People's Republic was actually formed, and instead of writing a new national anthem, they used something that already had a sense of identity and opted not to change it. But those ideas aren't nearly as reflective of modern Chinese society as the brief lyric change in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution may hint at. So, I guess that raises the question. That clip was from the 1935 film Children of Troubled Times, which was the origin of the song. I guess it wouldn't be fair to talk about March of the Volunteers without first giving you enough context and background information on the history of Chinese military music that you'd be able to appreciate its significance. If we want to go all the way back, the story of the Yellow Emperor in 2677 BCE is the earliest recorded appearance of music in military. He was being attacked by the Qiyu clan, and his army was weak and backed into a corner. It wasn't looking good for him, but he had an idea, and the next morning before dawn, he gathered up a large number of drums and horns and ordered his men to play them before the opposing army could get in formation. This confused the enemy so much, and at the same time inspired his own troops so much, that they were able to defeat this army that was much larger than they were. This is one of the stories of the man who was credited with being the progenitor of Chinese society and the founder of their civilization. As follows, military became deeply entwined with music in Chinese culture, and traditional Chinese brass and drum bands were present throughout all of its history up to the late Qing dynasty. The May 4th movement was born in 1919 as a response to the injustices Chinese people felt from the Treaty of Versailles, where their land was ceded to Japan without their consent. The movement was notably anti-Western, and this might explain why information regarding the presence of brass bands at the time is almost entirely absent from the modern record. The absence didn't last forever, though. There's some debate about when the end of the traditional Chinese brass band took place, with historian Zheng Jingqian claiming that the formation of the Tianjin Naval Band by then-court advisor Yuan Shikai in 1886 on the advisement of a German consultant marked the end of the era, although another scholar, Joseph Kaminsky, makes it a point that the German who made the band was instead hired by the general of the Naval Academy, Li Hongzong, and that in 1898 Yuan Shikai formed other military bands separate from that one. Either way, common consensus seems to be that Yuan Shikai was at least partly responsible for the westernization of military bands in an effort to modernize the Qing army at the end of the 19th century. One interesting anecdote which highlighted the direction the Qing government was going in, and is kind of ironic in hindsight, was the story of Sir Robert Hart's band, which he led out of Shanghai in the 1890s. They played a Western style, which over time gained popularity, and it got to the point where they were invited to play for the royal funeral in 1908. After Empress Dowager Cixi chose to put 3-year-old Puyi on the throne, the band played John Brown's Body. The song, which is to the melody of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, talks about a failed slave revolt and a desire for the people to carry on the legacy of revolution. The dynasty fell 5 years later. Whenever I think about this topic, my mind always goes back to Chongrong. The song debuted in this massive military parade in Hunan in 1906, and the name literally translates to worship weapons, although it's usually referred to as the military anthem. Its lyrics were the military code of honor. The melody of the song has been a topic of debate, and it's basically considered an unsolved mystery. Theories have been proposed, and one of the most interesting and thematically appropriate is that it has the same melody as the 3 major disciplines and 8 points of attention, a song that was later used by the CCP to teach its soldiers the military code of honor. After the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War in 1927 and the establishment of the NN Soviet 10 years later, both sides have recorded evidence of brass bands and bugle calls as part of their military, although the KMT side used it more technically, while the CCP had a more symbolic meaning. There were a lot of bugles in the Yan'an camp, and after a couple years, the bugle became associated with the Communist Party. The sights and sounds of the Yan'an camp inspired many books and films from left-wing writers in the 1930s, such as the film which gives us March of the Volunteers. That clip was from the 1935 film Children of Troubled Times, which was the origin of the song, written by Niar as a communist cry to allyship in a movie that focuses on leaving the westernized world of the KMT behind and fleeing to join the communist cause. It's interesting then that the Western bugle starts the song and went on to be a prominent symbol of the revolution in China, being described by Joseph Kaminsky as, quote, an icon, the likeness of the revolution itself. It goes to show that just because something came from somewhere doesn't mean that it'll always represent that thing. In the same way they repurposed the military anthem, they were able to repurpose the bugle and the brass band to become a symbol of revolution, despite the fact that it originated from the westernized culture they so despised. This enters us into a somewhat different era, where the Western brass band was not proletarian enough for the communist regime. They kept the drummers and buglers, but the main source of music was collective singing, which is really interesting considering there's not really a history of collective singing in China. They followed in the footsteps of the Russian army and began to write and sing on a mass scale. This new genre of mass songs, Niar was a proponent of, and alongside Liu Langmo, facilitated the creation of the National Salvation Song movement. The goal was to make simple and easy-to-learn melodies with powerful patriotic and communist lyrics, and the artists and composers should strive to be closer to the people, so that they could produce the songs the people needed, in an attempt to bridge the gap between the intellectuals and the masses in an era where intellectuals were looked down on, and the masses were held up as this pillar of societal ideal. This was very helpful in allowing the intellectuals to make themselves one with the proletariat. New Zealand journalist James Bertram gives an account in the late 1930s of what it was like to listen to these mass songs, although he didn't understand Chinese. He explains how, quote, always as they marched, the soldiers would sing the staccato marching songs of national salvation that one had heard in Shanghai and Xi'an. But sometimes it would be a tune more familiar to Western ears, and it was a curious experience to hear these mountain gorges ringing with the Internationale, or the Marseillaise, or a theme song from a Russian film, all rendered with a difference in throaty Chinese dialect. Compare this with the account of Chinese music historian Wang Yuhe, who tells us, quote, these revolutionary songs no longer resembled the folk songs of a previous era, which only rendered bitter accounts of one's misery, or related the freedom to love or a future auspicious life, but rather reflected how residents of the revolutionary base areas had acquired freedom and happiness in their new lives, or reflected the people's love and admiration for revolution, their leaders in the Red Army, and reflected the people's and soldiers' revolutionary struggles in the base area. These two accounts paint a picture of how both the Chinese and foreign songs the Red Army was singing were deeply rooted in revolution and very different from the music that came before them. A lot of this kind of music was criticized by the musicians that took refuge in the cities of the KMT during the Civil War for being too simple and against the artistry of music. But at the same time, this dichotomy between the fanciful, luxurious Western chamber music that was developing in cities like Shanghai and Chongqing and the simplicity of the National Salvation Song movement served the catalyst for a lot of the communist composers to realize that what they were making was music exclusively for the elites, and that this kind of mass music that the CCP popularized was the only way to speak to the common people. Such a realization is what inspired Niar to leave Western composing behind and eventually write what would become the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. His way of repurposing his Western knowledge was to use the Western form of the march and the bugle call, and at the same time combine it with music that was entirely written in the Chinese pentatonic scale. This led to the resonant and heroic and powerful sound of the March of the Volunteers, which was new for the people of China, but at the same time felt distinctly Chinese. The Eighth Army March, written in 1939 by Korean national Zheng Liucheng, is described by historian Joshua Howard as combining the martial qualities of the army song with a national style, noting the bugle motif, 2/4 march rhythm, and use of syncopation, compared to the traditional Chinese melody and pentatonic scale. It was the pride of the new Eighth Army. So imagine their surprise when they're marching into battle and they hear the enemy KMT army singing the same song. Howard suggests that the harassment of Liu Langmo and the National Salvation Song movement, which was supposed to be politically neutral by the KMT, resulted in a failure to develop a song movement within the ranks of their own military, and the void was filled by the songs of the Communist Party. The KMT soldiers enjoyed the songs so much and were likely so disillusioned with their own participation in the war that they adopted and began singing the songs, sometimes without changing them at all. There's no evidence that the Nationalist Party ever developed their own march songs or military anthems aside from the one Yuan Shikai wrote over 20 years prior. Chiang Kai-shek did make an attempt to form KMT military bands before the end of the Civil War, but his efforts were too little too late. He started a military music school in 1942 with the goal of creating instrumental bands for his army, but by that time the corruption and mismanagement of the KMT was too overwhelming, and the people, having been empowered by these mass proletarian songs, paid no mind. With the new democracy policy at the beginning of the founding of the PRC, more focus was made on creating a nation. This required some separation from the proletarian revolutionary mindset of the Civil War. People's Liberation Army made a Western military band, but more closely aligned with Russian and Eastern European styles, as was reflective of the new democracy period. The founding ceremony for the PRC took place on October 1st, 1949, and this was the debut of the PLA band. It was made up of elite musicians from different districts in the army, totaling 1,500 members. At that ceremony, they played March of the Volunteers, Defending the Fruits of Victory, and the 8th Army March, along with others. In the years to follow, they created a robust system for music education, creating military music schools and playing concerts across the country. In 1958, they had a joint concert with the Novosibirsk State Symphony to show their friendship with the USSR. There's an irony in the fact that a group of people so against the Western military bands and Western influence of the KMT were so proud of their new Western military band. Chairman Mao was quoted as saying, "Long live the military band," in 1950 on the second National Day ceremony of the PRC 1 year later. This isn't surprising, though. A lot of the next couple decades of China's history revolved around becoming more modernized and more Western while still fighting against the ideals of Western society. China was trying to come to grips with a society based on revolution and proletarian values in a world dominated by bureaucracy and politics and capitalism. The brass band, as it was constructed, with its Western influence and intellectual leaning, was often the target of this uncertainty. The Cultural Revolution, which took place across the decade of 1966 to 1976, saw the disbanding of almost every Western-influenced public band in China, with the exception of the People's Liberation Army Band surviving the purge alone. Postmodern China is a notably capitalist society. They adapted and adjusted and modernized in a way that made them a central power of a system they once deemed evil. The people who left China for America in the early to mid-20th century had a similar qualm on their hands. Do they follow the proletarian beliefs of their home country, or do they adapt and assimilate to a capitalist culture that doesn't subscribe to any of their fundamental ideas of government? Overseas Chinese in the U.S. made an effort to give back to the anti-Japanese war effort back home, creating fundraising organizations to do so. Another example of how music reflects culture is in the drum corps that formed from the Chinese-American fundraising societies in Los Angeles. There were two main groups, the Meiwa Girls Corps and the Los Angeles Imperial Dragons, both of which were attempts to perform Americanness on a national stage so that they could be accepted as Chinese Americans as opposed to just Chinese. When I think about all these things as a whole, it really just reminds me how impactful music is to history, not just as a lens through which to view historical events, but as a tool to be used by the people who make history happen. This whole time, all I've talked about is bands, instruments, songs, songwriters, lyrics, and composition, and yet through this conversation I've been able to understand the movement of ideas and culture and philosophy through the Chinese Revolution, and how the story of the formation of the People's Republic of China and the development of the ideas of the CCP gradually took from its environment and shaped itself into something new, a combination of politics, culture, and art. The historians I've mentioned thus far know this well. They too understand that you need only look at the evolution of music to get a full picture of culture and history. Look at music. Look at it. This is culture. This is people. It has a lot to tell us, if only we would listen. Thanks for watching. As always, all my sources are listed and timestamped in the spreadsheet in the description below, and I highly recommend you take a look since there's lots I didn't cover, and my summary is never a replacement for the original content I've used. If you found anything I mentioned interesting, the documents likely have more details. Any questions can be directed to the email in the spreadsheet as well. I know this is a pretty different kind of video, but I hope it was as enjoyable to watch as it was to make, and let me know if you'd like similar content in the future. Until next time.